The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I've been talking to you for a while now, and I even did a couple of interviews about the sort of signaling that Donald Trump has done to white nationalists and white supremacists with the things that he says and the policies that he proposes. And I've made the point before, and even white nationalists have made the point before on this program, that when Trump stops sort of short of what would be a much more obvious identification with white nationalism or white supremacy or sort of established xenophobia, if Donald Trump's statements have the effect of coalescing those groups, if those extremists see Trump as the best path, the most likely path to getting the world that they want, it kind of doesn't matter whether Trump is personally a white supremacist or a white nationalist or anti-Semitic or racist or xenophobic or whatever, because the impact on those groups and on policy still remains if that's how he's perceived by those individuals. And Richard Spencer, one of the most well-known white nationalists, I think at this point I would say in the world, was on the program, and he said, we get Trump can't say all of the things. We are choosing to ignore that Trump's daughter converted to Judaism and Trump's son-in-law is Jewish. We understand the signals he sends, and we see him as our best path forward. And along those lines, there's a really interesting report in the New York Daily News who spoke to a former white nationalist named Derek Black, who's actually the son of, I think it's Don Black, I forget the name, of another very well-known white nationalist. And Derek Black explained, it's not just Trump's rhetoric that signals white nationalists and his language, but his policies also signal white nationalists. And first thing, I'm going to play a little clip for you here. Derek Black was asked about Trump not condemning neo-Nazis at the Charlottesville march, and he explained how a white nationalist would read Trump's statements. Take a look.
Would you say also kind of his unwillingness to condemn like the attacks in Charlottesville, and he said, you know, there was bad people on both sides, and even recently he referred to himself as a nationalist. You know, what, do you think instances like that? Has there been any one event that really kind of made you go, whoa?
The fact that he wasn't willing to condemn Charlottesville absolutely shocked me, because up till that point I had thought there's a lot of overlap in the things that he believes and the things that white nationalists believe, and that was shocking. But it could at least feel like if he had the opportunity to condemn white nationalists that he always would, and he didn't do that, and that was very alarming. The fact that he could look at an outright white nationalist event with Nazi flags and say that some of those people are really good and what they're marching for is itself good, that was just absolutely mind-boggling.
And then you get into the material where Derek Black goes on to say during the interview that when you look at the package of policies that this administration has supported or proposed or sort of shown an interest in, it's a very clear signal to white nationalists. Limiting immigration from, we can say it now, shithole countries and increasing immigration from Norway or moving immigration from those countries to Norway, that's a very clear policy signal. Shutting down all Muslim immigration. Earlier this week, talking about birthright citizenship at a time when you've got a lot of the media attention on immigrants coming from Latin American countries where people are disproportionately brown, militarizing the border to stop those asylum seekers, saying, as the interviewer mentioned in that clip, I am a nationalist last week or the week before. When you step back for a second and realize that Trump's Jewish son-in-law isn't really the important thing here, you see the big picture. And this is an ex-KKK guy, son of one of the most prominent white nationalists in the country, in the world, explaining how the white nationalists see Trump. And then when you see something like this next clip, you are immediately, if you're a white nationalist, going to say, that is my guy. Remember when Trump did this?
I want to ask you about the Anti-Defamation League, which this week called on you to publicly condemn unequivocally the racism of former KKK Grand Wizard David Duke, who recently said that voting against you at this point would be treason to your heritage. Will you unequivocally condemn David Duke and say that you don't want his vote or that of other white supremacists in this election?
Well, just so you understand, I don't know anything about David Duke, okay? I don't know anything about what you're even talking about with white supremacy or white supremacists. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know, did he endorse me or what's going on? Because, you know, I know nothing about David Duke. I know nothing about white supremacists. And so you're asking me a question that I'm supposed to be talking about people that I know nothing about.
The idea that Trump knew nothing about it is ridiculous. We later found out that he did. But does the question, do you condemn David Duke, really need a clarification 24 hours later? Relevant quote, Andrew Gillum recently said about his opponent, Ron DeSantis in Florida. Now, I'm not calling DeSantis a racist. I'm simply saying the racists believe he's a racist. And that is what applies here to Donald Trump and to this issue. Richard Spencer has said it. Former KKK people are saying it. It's the reality, folks. If he is perceived as white nationalist or xenophobic or whatever else by those individuals, that's what matters. And he's coalescing and activating them. Am I wrong? Well, let me know. I'm on Twitter at dpacman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pacman Show.
The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com. The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Matt Clark. Matt, thank you for being a David Pacman Show member. Also want to say thanks to Dina Sewell, who has been with us since 2013. Dina, a member for more than 5 years. Today's David Pacman Show, longtime supporting member of the day. All right, let's give this a shot. We're going to try the phones for the first time from the new studio, 617-830-4750. Could be a disaster. Hopefully the phone system has been configured correctly. And if so, we should be able to hear very soon from our caller in the 646 area code. Caller from 646, can you hear me? And most importantly, can we hear you?
I can hear you very well. Can you hear me?
We can. Go ahead. Who's this? What's on your mind?
Great. My name is Mary, and congratulations on the new studio.
Oh, thank you.
And I did have a question for you. So I have a little show, and I listen to you and Tom Hartman and others, you know, Sam Cedar, et cetera. I'd like your take on, and Benjamin Dixon is fantastic as well. I would like your take on sort of, there's a little bit of a how do I put this, a split on the left regarding identity politics.
Yes.
And given what's happening now, we are not in the people kind of want to stay stuck in the 2016 primary. And I've been saying on my show, I've had journalists on, I've had candidates across the country. We can't stay stuck in the 2016 primary. That's not where we are now. I've been saying, you know, we have to look at what's happening now. And I would just like your thoughts. I don't know if you've been listening to Ben Dixon or you're just sort of, there's a little bit of fighting going on, you know, regarding identity politics versus, like, say, class, you know, a class, talking about class first or, you know, identity politics. Just
I'm
your
not,
thoughts.
so who's Ben fighting with? I'm not up to speed on that.
It's not about fighting. It's just like there's just been a little bit of a infighting or a little bit of a, you know how it is on the left, we're like herding cats, right?
Yeah.
And
so here's my thought. Okay, I didn't know if Ben was involved.
Confusion around identity politics.
I didn't know if Ben was involved in a specific thing. So here's my
not
thought.
Really. He's just been great. He's just someone else I admire who has great thoughts on it.
I got you, Mary. By the way, if we are on speakerphone or Bluetooth, please do take us off because we're having a hard time hearing you. So listen, here's my thought on the identity politics thing. Number one, the split is actually not nearly as big as the right would like you to believe. The people on the left who are mishandling identity politics are actually not that significant, but there are people who are mishandling it. So what is the right approach on identity politics versus race and whatever else? Number one, identity relates, and class, not race. Identity relates to class in really important ways in the United States. That's number one. So the debate over identity versus class is not really a total black and white thing the way some would make you believe. That's number one. Identity is how you exist in the world. So if anyone wants to pretend that identity is irrelevant for the political world, for figuring out what humans should be doing on the planet, identity matters and identity is important. Where you go over the line is where identity becomes a trump card to decide who gets to speak, who should be listened to, what the only ways of thinking about an issue should be. So identity politics, when done wrong, is a problem. It's not as big of an issue as the right wants you to believe it is on the left. And we should understand that people's identity gives them a perspective on issues that is important and it is relevant and it should be listened to. It's just not a trump card. That's it. It's actually a much simpler issue than many are making it out to be.
Well, thank you so much. You always bring clarity to an issue. Thank you so much. And congratulations on the studio.
Thank you. Great to hear from you. Good to hear that the phone system's working at the new studio. Let's go next to our caller from the 408 area code. 408 historically has been a tough area code for us. Sometimes it goes great and sometimes it doesn't. Let's see what it is today. Who's there from 408?
Hey, David, can you hear me?
I can. Who's this?
My name is Dakota. I'm calling from Saratoga, California.
Awesome. What's on your mind today?
I wanted to go ask you for some advice.
Okay.
I don't really plan on voting in the 2018 midterms.
So what advice do you have?
And it's I'm just mainly because why should I care and why should I vote if nothing I care about is being talked about?
Give me so where in California are you?
Saratoga. It's south of San Jose.
Okay, so I gotcha. I just didn't know where Saratoga was. And what do you care about?
Mental health reform. Getting people who are mentally ill, better care than what we have now.
Okay, and in what way would they receive better care, would you say? And Dakota, I don't know what's going on in the background there, but if we're on speaker, please take us off. And if it sounds like there's
I'm not on speaker. I'm using the earbuds.
Or something like that.
Oh, I'm at my college. I'll go to a much more quieter area.
So listen, here's the thing, Dakota. I hear you talking about how mental health reform is important to you. There are two major ways in which our elected officials, even if they're not talking about mental health reform specifically, are going to impact mental health reform. Number one, the discussion around healthcare is a huge conversation about mental health reform, because mental health in our country, not only the way that it's stigmatized, but the way that people get access to it, is mostly through the healthcare system that we have. So every single elected official that's talking about the health insurance system and healthcare is talking about your issue, even if they're not using the language that makes it sound that way. Number two, the criminal justice system is hugely connected to mental health and mental health reform. So every time that our elected officials are making decisions about the criminal justice system, they are dealing with mental health reform. But I want to even go a step further. Let's pretend for a second that nothing our elected officials did related to mental health reform in any way that you can tell. Don't we want to have a say over who's in there so that we can put people in that are more likely to be convinced by us to deal with the issue of mental health reform? Like if you say, I'm gonna opt out and just not have a say whatsoever, you now are no longer playing a role in evaluating who of these candidates is more likely to be convincible on the issues that are important to me.
But here's the thing, they're not treating it as an important issue. They're treating more stuff like Trump, whatever Trump's doing, as more of an important issue or right-wing extremism rather than mentally disturbed people that get access to guns. No, but listen,
Dakota, this is the wrong approach. Think about the $15 minimum wage, okay? If there hadn't been years and years of elections that were decided that led to a point at which the Democratic Party said, we're going to support a $15 minimum wage. I'm not pretending like this is the be-all, end-all of economic justice or anything, but it's just an example. nobody was talking about a $15 minimum wage for years when the people that ultimately decided this will become part of the Democratic Party platform decided it, okay? If we had opted out of selecting who represents us during that entire period, you never would have had people in positions to even be convinced about a $15 minimum wage. So I just think it's the wrong approach to say, because I don't hear them talking about my one topic, I'm not going to vote. I think it's a mistake, and it's not a neutral act. It's a destructive act, and I would encourage you to vote, Dakota.
All right, thank you. I just really think the hospitals need better psychologists and better sort of evaluations and care, because I've been through the facility, and it's basically a nicer version of prison. So to make of that what you will.
I don't disagree with you, but you've got to start by putting in the people you think are most likely to hear you on those issues. Dakota, thank you. I hope you will vote, and I appreciate the call. Let's go to our next caller from the 234 area code. Caller from 234. Who's this? What's on your mind today?
Is that me?
That is you. Who's this?
My name's Seth. I'm from Ohio.
What's going on, Seth?
I feel like it's almost like the first two people that you answered alluded to what I'm about to ask, but it's kind of a vague question.
Okay.
The first caller said something about how people are kind of like stuck in the primaries and stuff like that. And I try not to let the fact that Trump is president get me down. Like, I know that, and the other caller you just answered, like, voting is very important, even if you feel like maybe it's a lost cause. But I guess my question is, like, how do we not get so depressed when thinking about Trump as president? Or how do we not get so, like, down about all of the corruption and money in politics? Like, what can we do about a lot of that? Like, what can everyday people do to change those things other than maybe just voting, right?
So listen, definitely check out my video about what forms of activism are effective from a couple of weeks ago. I don't want to rehash the entire video, but let me deal with the depression part of it. I hate to make this argument because I feel like it is just, it's depressing to even have to make this argument about being depressed about the state of politics. But the most important thing that got me reactivated when I was sort of in the doldrums of this disaster that is the Trump administration was that if I self-select out now, it's going to get worse. And it's an unfortunate argument to have to make. And some of us might be thinking, how could it possibly get worse? This really seems like we've hit rock bottom. But if the people that are disturbed by what's going on are depressed out of the system, so to speak, it's only going to get worse. So it is critical that we not abandon the political process at this time. Voting is important. Public demonstrations, being in touch with your elected officials, voting locally, even when there is not a national election. I've talked about civil disobedience, general strikes. Check out my video about activism, but this is the worst possible time to self-select out.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, David.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate the phone call. Didn't know if there was a follow-up there, but I appreciate the call. Let's go next to our caller from the 682 area code. Caller from 682, introduce yourself. Tell us where you're calling from. What's on your mind today?
Hi, this is Thomas. I'm from Dallas, Texas.
What's on your mind today?
I have a question about Trump saying that he wants to use an executive order to effectively get rid of the 14th Amendment. I just have some points on that. It's just basically the 14th Amendment makes it so that it is effectively legalizing birthright citizenship. I mean, I'm not really sure like how you would define if you were an American citizen, like whether you have to be born from an American vagina or something.
Okay,
just,
go on.
It's just like, it says you have to be born, if you're born in this land, then you're effectively an American citizen and a citizen of the state that you're in. And I watched TYT talk about birthright citizenship and how if you get rid of it, then you're basically disenfranchising millions of potential voters. And it was also funny when they mentioned how like Trump's older children could be affected by it too, since they weren't. It was effectively like a birthright citizenship.
Well, yes and no. I mean,
citizenship,
yes, I
okay.
understand that their mother was naturalized, but I mean, their father was an American citizen, so I get that. I think it's sort of one of those arguments that's sort of meme worthy, but I don't know how good of an argument it is. Did you have a question or a particular thing you wanted me to comment on? Because I did do a commentary earlier in the week about that birthright citizenship thing. What was there something in specific you wanted to ask about?
If Trump actually goes ahead and just like signs an executive order, what do you think would happen from that? Would people just, would the entire body of Congress just say no? Or, I mean, would it actually be legal or whatever?
From what I've read,
I know there's like a giant process to get an amendment removed.
Yes, there is. From what I've read, the consensus of the legal community is that it would not fly. There are a few conservative legal opinions that say that you can, without changing the 14th Amendment, you can dictate policy via executive order in such a way that would allow you to do that, but then the next president would immediately be able to change it if they wanted. We're still learning about the legal aspects of it. I think it would be an uphill battle, and I don't think ultimately he would be able to do it via executive order. Thank you so much for the call. Really appreciate it. 617-830-4750. Let's see who else is on the phone today. We have 32 people holding, more than we've ever had. Let's try the 216 area code. Caller from 216. Hello, who are you? Where are you calling from? What's on your mind today?
Hey, David. My name's Ken. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. I had a couple I'd like to maybe frame a premise for you to kind of respond to, and
sure,
you can tell me what you think. I actually was just listening to a while this week your debate about the death penalty, and it really tied together well with I don't know if you've heard of kayfabe or watch pro wrestling. Wisecrack on YouTube had a good. I don't know if are you familiar with that term, kayfabe?
I am not.
Okay, it's sort of when there's a presentation or entertainment where the presenters know they're fake and the audience know they're fake, but everyone's kind of playing along. And it sort of went perfectly with kind of your discussion about the death penalty, where you had people who it seemed like had never even been in a courtroom talking about these very high level and complicated issues. And I see this all the time. I actually heard Glenn Lowry with Larry Koltikoff, the economist. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but they were talking about affirmative action. And Larry talks about, how just a very basic, and meanwhile, Glenn's like, oh, what if we just get rid of it? And Glenn's point is very well taken in with all the different intricacies of it. And I guess what I think is these issues that we're talking about, when you talk about $15 minimum wage, affirmative action, universal health care, things like this, they're just too complicated. And we have this party in the Democrats that, as another caller said, almost feels so divided, but there's just these answers, these tailored answers that are barely policy prescriptions that it just doesn't feel like I have trouble just worrying about the Democrats and voting for a Democrat because I don't see real answers because the right is just so dysfunctional. But I have a problem with the Democrats because we're not able to make these holistic policies because they're worried about getting enough votes to compete with Republicans. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does. Yes, Ken, I think I got you. You're shot out of a cannon today, and I love it. So here's the thing. I get what you're saying, that particularly when you're in the opposition, you have to sort of try to lay out your position or policy idea as simply as possible in order for it to at least appear politically viable. And that doesn't really get us nuanced discussions of policy. But I don't know that I agree with you that that Democrats are just wrong on a lot of these. I mean, so like, for example, Medicare for all, as an example, which is not the official position of the Democratic Party, but there are increasingly more and more Democrats who support that. Yes, you can get Sorry, Ken, would it be okay if I give you the full answer?
Yes, okay.
Okay. You can make the argument that in order to actually get to the point of implementation of Medicare for all, Yes, you need a lot of different systems. You need to figure out the financial side of it. You need to figure out the legal side of it. You need to figure out the technical and implementation and logistical side of it. But just because you have more and more Democrats saying, hold on a second, we know of another system that would work, and it's Medicare for all, I don't know that that's really something fair to criticize the Democrats on, because they're sort of coming up with these one-liners, because that's step one in moving the conversation.
Okay, yes, that's a great answer. But where I disagree with you, and I don't know if you've looked into many of the races, is the Democrats have a tough time with Medicare for all, the established Democrats. There was a great expose on This American Life a couple weeks ago where they actually detailed some primary races, several across the country, where Medicare for all Democrats were not able to secure funding at all from the Democratic Party, and were actually shunned from basically receiving funding and information.
Okay,
so I
but
think
that understandably, that's a different argument. The argument that, so I was just using Medicare for all as an example, but your initial criticism was you just weren't hearing depth and nuance and ideas from Democrats. Now you're saying you are hearing it, but the Democratic Party won't fund them, which is that's a relevant conversation, but a very different one.
Well, I think it's intertwined, because you can't have the conversations within the Democratic Party, because the special interests within the Democratic Party are more interested in one-liners. And maybe it isn't Medicare for all, but and I do agree with your premise that obviously you want.
Okay, and with that pop, we lost Ken. We may have gotten as far as we were going to go. Let me see if I can take one more call quickly before we've got to go. Let's go to the 610 area code. Caller from 610. Jump right in. Tell me who you are and what your question is today.
Good afternoon, David. My name is Alex. I'm from Pennsylvania. And Kanye West recently said he wanted to stop talking about politics. I wanted to know what you thought about that.
I think that's good. Alex, how old are you, by the way?
I'm 18.
18, okay. So are you like, I guess I'm trying to ascertain, are you in the generation that likes Kanye West music?
I mean, I'm not really a fan of his music, but like, I've sort of been interested in like what he was doing ever since he came out and supported Trump.
Okay, so you're kind of like me. You don't care for the music, but you are interested in his place in politics. I think it's good that he's stepping back. He said he was used to support political positions, to push political positions he doesn't actually support. I feel bad for the guy. I do think that he is having a mental health situation. I think it's good that he's decided to step back. I don't absolve him of personal responsibility. He decided to go and talk to Trump and meet with Trump at the White House and to wear the MAGA hat, right? I mean, ultimately he bears some responsibility. I don't think the guy is well, and I think it'll be good for him to step away from politics.
Yeah, like I don't think he's a bad person. Like, but like there's some people who are like making him out to be a bad person, but I don't think that.
Yeah, I don't particularly think he's a bad person either. I think he just doesn't know what he's talking about in a lot of cases, and he's struggling, and he was manipulated by a movement that's pretty horrible.
Yeah.
All right, Alex, thank you for the call. Really appreciate it. Thanks to everybody who called in. First time we took live calls today at the new studio. I do apologize to the 20 people still holding that I am not going to be able to get to today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
For this week's classic interview, important topic that has come up a lot since we actually did this interview 5.5 years ago. The topic is violence in media and violence in real life. And this relates to the dozen pipe bombs that were sent last week by the MAGA bomber. This relates to all sorts of different real-world violence. The interview was with Professor Erica Scharrer from the University of Massachusetts, my undergraduate alma mater, and a very relevant issue given the state of politics in the United States. Let's get right into this classic interview with Professor Scharrer from January of 2013. Joining me is Professor Erica Scharrer from the University of Massachusetts Department of Communication, my undergraduate alma mater. Erica, we've had since the Newtown shooting, and really before then, but really it's been very prevalent since the Newtown shooting, this idea, in part perpetrated by those who want to avoid new regulations on guns, the finger pointed at violence in video games and or movies as a possible cause for gun violence in the United States. I think there's no better way to get into it than just to get your overall sense of that. You've studied this. This is an area that you know a lot about. What does research say about the effect of violence in video games and movies on real-world violence?
That's an excellent question, and it is the question of the hour for sure. And like a lot of questions, it's complicated. So my answer might be a little bit long. But, you know, there is the job of the social science researcher is to try to examine these critical social questions as best as she or he can, given the limits of social science research. And, you know, that sort of generic disclaimer will end up being pretty pertinent to this question, because what has been done pretty convincingly is that a link has been found in an experimental laboratory setting between people who play a violent video game or, in some cases, watch a violent movie or a violent television show and their aggression. And so the word aggression is sort of a pivotal word choice here. It's part of the rub in trying to answer the big question about whether media violence can indeed have a bearing on real-world violence, is that there is inevitably a pretty big disconnect between the ways that we can measure aggression in a study, whether it's in a laboratory setting, or sometimes we also survey people to see, you know, oh, how much do you watch of this thing, or how much time do you spend with these sorts of media forms? And then we ask them to self-report either behavioral tendencies or attitudes toward aggression. Or in the laboratory setting, we might set up some sort of outcome that we measure the degree to which people will engage in it. So whether it's something like an evaluation of someone, which could be negative and harsh or could be gentle, expressions of hypotheticals, like what would you do in this scenario, and you try to measure the degree of aggression in the person's response.
So when you talk about measuring aggression, what you're saying is that there has been some link to some extent between violence in video games and movies and the definition of aggression as indicated by an academic survey or study that is done. But then the question of whether those people end up committing acts of violence, that does not exist at this point.
And I think it's almost impossible to have it exist. You know, there are a couple sort of more macro level observations to make that would help illuminate this question. And one is, you know, what are crime rates? You know, what is the status of crime rates either in the U.S. or in other places of the world, and how might those correspond with the circulation of violent entertainment media? And they don't correspond. You know, we have more sources of entertainment violence, arguably, at this point in history than we ever have before. And yet, for the most part in the United States, violent crime is down. And you know, we can also make some cross-cultural comparisons that will call into question the overall potential of violent media to contribute to real-world violence. You know, what about in other locations where there are very similar media being circulated with similar amounts of violence? In fact, you know, one of the sort of goals for modern media companies to make money is for global circulation of their products. And so it's very similar media content, and yet cross-culturally often, you know, not similar at all violent crime rates. So clearly there's something more going on that the macro level of analysis will show us that sometimes those more micro level studies in, say, a lab setting might not.
A couple of years ago, we interviewed your colleague, Michael Morgan, and he was featured in the documentary film Mean World Syndrome. And one of the big takeaways from him was that violence in video games and movies does not make people more violent, but that it does make them more afraid of violence being committed against them. Now, some portion of crime maybe could be attributed to people being afraid and acting out of fear. And again, I'm being completely hypothetical and just imagining what other connections could someone draw. But to point to that as the link, it seems a little bit, not a very strong argument to make.
I agree. And I think, if we're talking about prevalence, how likely is there to be a link between some kind of violent media that someone consumed and an ultra aggressive or violent and terribly tragic, as we saw in Newtown and other school or mass shootings? That sort of connection is so, of course, obviously, logically less likely to occur. You can argue that by the tens of thousands to millions of people who consume the same media content as others and obviously do not have that extreme response. But if we talk about more prevalent effects, then we do get into things like Professor Morgan was talking about with this sort of concept of fear and that the world is a dangerous place. And as you said, too, that may then precipitate some sort of sense of being, armed and ready to deal with whatever the world may bring. Then the other consequence that I would like to point out is the notion of desensitization. And, I would argue that that's probably a more prevalent effect than a violent effect of violent media consumption is, and that's just the notion that the more we consume this stuff, the more our culture is flooded with violent images, the less likely they are to register as a big deal, the less likely they are to evoke a sympathetic response, the less likely they are to seem shocking or disturbing.
Yeah, and I think we've experienced that on this program even, because since the Newtown shooting, we've kind of, I don't know that we've been going out of our way, but I think a lot of media have been pointing to say, it's tragic the number of people that were killed in that one instance, but here's 20 others where only 1 or 2 people were killed. When you look at the specific circumstances, looked at individually, they should be shocking, but it's almost like they become part of this broader landscape that this stuff just happens all the time.
I think so, and that's what makes something like Newtown stand out. And I guess I'm glad that as a collective, we're not so desensitized as a culture.
That it's not even reported.
Exactly so, and that clearly there is an impact, and clearly there is an emotional impact from something like this. The tender age of the victims, the mass, quality of the shootings, and so yes, I think that's right. That we read about this day in and day out in the news. If it's not in the news, it's in the television shows that we consume. If it's not in the television shows that we consume, it's in the games that we play. And so a certain level of expectation of violence surrounding us is, it seems to me, part of the modern sensibility. And just to connect sort of the macro level observation with more micro level studies, this too is something that researchers have studied in the lab or in, an experimental setting. And, there have been links found as well with the more someone is exposed to violent images, the less likely they will register some kind of concern. Sometimes that's physiological concern, like a heightened heart rate. Sometimes it's like self-report for sympathy for victims. And there have even been some studies where the researchers have set up this sort of false scenario where supposedly there's a fight breaking out, and people who are in this study, they've either seen something violent or violent media content, or they've seen non-violent media content, and the researchers study how long it takes for them to respond to this ostensible conflict that's emerging. And there has been a differential between the people who have seen the violent media content and those who have not. So this notion of desensitization, I think, is also a powerful one to consider.
Last thing, then, just to circle back and kind of put the fine point on this, the specific claim by the NRA and other groups that violence in video games and movies is directly responsible for the gun violence problem in this country. Academically, there is nothing that would support that statement.
I would just trace back to the concept of aggression.
Okay.
And can I mention too, David, that there is what we call a meta-analysis, and that's an analysis, a quantitative sort of aggregation of all the existing studies on a single topic. And there are meta-analyses seem to be sort of a way to make a pretty massive claim based on a big body of research. And there is a meta-analysis that was done on television violence and aggression. And what that found is that the size of the influence of the television effect on the concept of aggression, as it's been studied in lots of different ways, the size of that effect shrinks when that aggressive outcome is more severe. So in something like a real-life shooting, which is thankfully still an extreme and severe act of violence, the statistical link between media exposure has been shown to be smaller than a more minor aggressive response.
All right, we've been speaking with Professor Erica Scharrer from the University of Massachusetts Department of Communication. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Let's get into audience questions for the week. 3 really good questions. Submit questions however you want. Email, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. I don't know. First one's from Mark. Mark says, we hear a lot about economic inequality and the wage gap, reducing it increasing, debates over what's actually going on. But what about answering the question, why is economic inequality actually bad? Yeah, this is a good question for a couple different reasons. I mean, number one, it's really important for us to consider that just because you point out that something is unequal doesn't necessarily mean that it's unfair. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that inequality is bad. So this is exactly the type of question that I think is an important one. But you've got to talk about it in good faith, right? Because the arguments of freedom and liberty dictating that whatever inequality level results in societies is the right one because people should be free to do or not do whatever they want. That's not a good argument. And it also implies that the government sort of has no role in mitigating circumstances that are potentially bad for everybody in society or for specific groups. So let's sort of start there. When you have a high degree of economic inequality, that gives wealthier people a higher degree of control over the lives of others by virtue of being able to influence the status quo and the systems that are in place. And in the United States, when you have a Supreme Court ruling that effectively says that money is speech, you are in a practical way codifying that and saying, yes, we here money is speech. If you have more money, you have more speech. And we have an extraordinarily high level of inequality, which means that when we look at our system, if we want to believe that it is a meritocracy and a true democracy, and I know people will say, David, we're not a democracy, we're a constitutional republic. You know what I'm talking about here. We simply don't have that when we have this degree of inequality. That's number one. Number two, significant degrees of economic inequality, or what we would call a wealth gap, can also undermine the fairness of political, legal, and legislative institutions. And we see that in the United States. And that, I would argue, is objectively bad because you have disenfranchisement. You have the subjugation of certain groups of people. And we could talk about what groups those are. Because of the degree of inequality that we have in the United States, we have two justice systems. We talk about that all the time when it comes to incarceration, when it comes to street crime versus white-collar crime versus corporate crime. We have all of those things in part because of the degree of economic inequality that we experience. And then to make a sort of societal good argument, and this resonates with some people and it doesn't resonate with others depending on your political outlook, the negative externalities of extreme inequality are malignant. It's a malignant problem in society. Crime is one example. We know that when you have higher degrees of inequality, you have increasing crime, even though over a long period of time, the crime rate in the United States has been going down. So if we say that an interest of the government or of society is to reduce criminality, then we should be looking at inequality as something that we could focus on. Now, am I suggesting that we should have equality, total equality in terms of people's wealth and people's incomes? Of course not. And I actually don't know, short of actual socialists and communists, and even sometimes they make concessions on this issue, I don't know of any social democrats that think that we should have a total evening or a total equality in terms of wealth. What I would like to see is more aggressive taxation at the very high level in order to sort of dampen that very, very top, the people who are hoarding money to no benefit of the economy whatsoever, and a sort of raising of the bottom. That is a way to reduce income inequality while still allowing successful entrepreneurs and others to have the success that they want, while improving on a lot of these metrics at the society level. And then lastly, I also want to point out that if you support the sort of capitalist mixed economy of some kind, or even a capitalist economy because of innovation that you believe that it provides, inequality reduces innovation because the innovators aren't always the actual rich people, but it's often those that they employ or people who are not yet rich. And when you have a high degree of inequality, you are disincentivizing those that are not already at the top from innovating because they may not perceive the benefits to be what they potentially would be in a different scenario. They may also not be enabled or in a situation where they can pursue that. So innovation is also hurt by inequality. These are a few reasons. And if your response will be, why not just work on ending poverty rather than reducing inequality? From a strictly mathematical standpoint, if everything stays the same, except everybody who's below the poverty level is lifted to the poverty level, that is a reduction of inequality. You're effectively calling for the same thing. Then it just becomes a matter sort of degree. And once we're talking about degrees, you've already conceded that we should seek to reduce inequality. Hey, David, you talk a lot about reading. Should it be embarrassing not to read regularly? No, it shouldn't be embarrassing because I don't know if embarrassing or shaming people that don't read is the best way to get people to read. But I think from an early age, it can become sort of stigmatized to be a bookworm or to be someone who likes to read. And that's a problem because reading habits are often determined pretty early on in life, both when it comes to parents reading to their kids, but also the reaction that kids get in school when they carry around a book that you don't have to be reading that book and you're still reading a book. When kids get made fun of for that, you're stigmatizing reading in a way. So I don't think it should be embarrassing not to read, but it should be a completely encouraged activity at all levels of society. A lot of this is formed during school years. And the problem is that education has become political in the United States. We know that all else being equal, now I'll give you exceptions in a second, but all else being equal, more education leads to people being more to the left, reading more about the world in an honest way. And I don't mean reading those pop nonfiction bestsellers like Tucker Carlson and Ann Coulter and Laura Ingraham stuff, but really reading about the world, reading about behavioral economics and history and philosophy and even reading a diverse selection of fiction books. That is going to have a liberalizing effect on the world population. And so we've already seen that the right is sort of planting their feet, drawing a line in the sand on the issue of education. We had that famous clip from Rick Santorum from years ago about we are never going to have the intelligent people, the educated. They're just never going to be on our side. And it's not because of an indoctrinary sort of circumstance. It's because the more you learn about the world around you, the more educated you are, the more well-rounded you are in terms of your knowledge of the world now and as it used to be, you are more likely to move to the left. So that is also a problem, and that doesn't relate so much to reading specifically, but reading as sort of a characteristic of having a worldview that is better formed. And so we are fighting not only stigma about nerdy reading activities, but we're also fighting the way that the right has successfully stigmatized education. And we've got to fight both. And people should be reading more. And I will continue to make every effort to show you that by reading, you become a more informed human who exists in the world. And it's a good thing. And I'll keep recommending books to you that I'm reading. Brittany wrote in saying, hey, David, what did you find most difficult about immigrating to the United States as a child? I think it would be good for you to share your experience because it is very easy now to forget in the wake of all of the xenophobia and anti-immigration ideology from the current administration that moving to another country is not something that people do lightly or take lightly. This is a really good point, Brittany, and I've pointed this out before. there is a framing of those who are moving, immigrating, as people who are just sort of haphazardly, uneducatedly saying, what the hell, I'm just going to go to another country. And having done it myself at the age of 5, where it is easier to adjust than as an adult, I can tell you from personal experience that it is really difficult. And it is arguably the most impactful decision that my parents ever made on my life, sort of beyond just day-to-day parenting decisions. And the most difficult things for me were I was dropped into a place, even at 5 years old, you might not realize the amount of sort of shared history, culture, and knowledge that 5-year-olds have. But it went beyond just language. I mean, I remember being the kid who was bringing weird lunches to school, and people were saying, what is that? And peanut butter and jelly, I didn't know my parents didn't know about peanut butter and jelly, just sort of a little thing, a staple of the little kid lunch. Language was problematic. I remember at one point in first grade when I was 6, and at this point I had been in the U.S. for a year already, half a year, something like that. Kids saying what I thought was, Joey said square, and me not understanding square. It's a shape. I don't understand why we're not allowed to say square. Geometry at this point is not allowed. And what they were saying was, Joey said a swear. And those things just make you feel like an outsider. And it was a good probably year and a half, couple years until my language got up to speed and I sort of started to have more of that understanding. And that was a 5-year-old. Imagine as a 15-year-old or as a 25-year-old or as a 35-year-old being dropped into a country where you lack the language, the culture, and that shared sort of community history. And it becomes very obvious why many times immigrants will exist mostly within communities of people from the country they came from or the religion they came from or some other shared ideology, because it is extraordinarily difficult. And obviously being however many thousands of miles Massachusetts is from Argentina, what is it, 6,000 miles, something like that? Don't remember now. Just being far from family was also extraordinarily difficult. So yeah, I mean, Brittany, I think you're on to something that is really important, which is the framing of immigrants as people who are abruptly and uncaringly leaving, for the most part, the one place they've known, the one country they've lived in the entire lives, merely to try to show up and suck up government welfare benefits or commit crimes or whatever. These are life-altering, major, major decisions, and we should always remember that that's the case. We have a great bonus show coming up for you today. We will talk about Sarah Huckabee Sanders being completely unable to name a single fake news outlet. Food stamps for soda. Is it time to end the $1 billion subsidy for sugary drinks? I think that it is. And a story about a same-sex couple carrying what some are calling a miracle baby that some are saying is the world's first. All of those stories and much more on today's bonus show. I hope you will. Please sign up. Please become a member. Because membership is the #1 funding source for the program. You can get access to the bonus show by signing up at www.joinpacman.com or by becoming a patron for at least $5 a month at patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.